I'm interviewing today Wouter Van Acker from the School of Architecture at Griffith University. Wouter has written on the Belgian bibliographer Paul Otlet, and in particular he's been interested in the visualisation of knowledge that Otlet produced. And on the Google Cultural Institute project, he's established a website on mapping knowledge. So we're going to ask us a number of questions and discuss very briefly Otlet as an introduction to this project. So, Wouter, firstly, I know that Paul Otlet has received a lot of attention in recent years. In 2008, he was described in the New York Times as the forgotten father of the World Wide Web. Quite a description. And in the Science Museum in London, in the New Information Gallery, we find Otlet next to Tim Berners-Lee and Vannevar Bush, both seen as forerunners of the World Wide Web or hypertext or various digital technologies. So how can it be that a person who didn't have a place in history for almost 40 years after his death in 1944 has now been accepted as a major figure within the field of information history?
I think it's indeed remarkable that Otlet now is probably better known now at this moment than he was in his own lifetime. So it's almost... you could compare it to Bach almost, who has also been rediscovered after his life. I think, well, of course it has to do, first of all, the fact that he was marginalized already during the last part of his life, so during the interwar period. Then during the Second World War, a lot of his collections were destroyed, and then because he hadn't attained the recognition he deserved. Also after the Second World War, a lot of his collections disappeared and got lost. And it's only from after the 1970s that these collections were put into a secure place, that gradually these collections were being restored and made accessible. Also scholars started to write about Otlet. And so it's only, I think, in the last 10 years, let's say, that Otlet now is acknowledged as, or his work is acknowledged as being of monumental importance for the study of the history of information science.
Right. I gather, though, at the same time as, or roughly the same time as he was being rediscovered, that rediscovery was accompanied by a view amongst some scholars that Otlet was someone who was obsessed by the dream to control the world by classifying it, that he was a sort of monomaniac with a single obsession. What do you think about that description?
Yeah, I think, well, one of the most explicit ones was where Otlet was listed or included in an exhibition in the museum Dr. Ghislain in Ghent. It's a museum of psychiatry, and the exhibition was on morozovs, so about people who have these complete theories, comprehensive theories that become almost absurd in their comprehensiveness. You also had a theater show that was staged by the Theatre ad hoc, and they made a show about the tragedy and humor of Otlet's urge to completeness. So it's certainly tempting to look at Otlet as a stereotypical utopian and all the drama that comes with it, the drama of not being able to complete and actually achieve or realize these dreams that he pursued. But I think that his visions cannot be judged or valued on the basis of whether they have been realized or not. I think rather to understand these visions, you need to place them within the social, intellectual, and also disciplinary context, really to understand what Otlet's commitment to his own visions really were. And then you can see the provocative realists behind the megalomaniac in a positive sense, but also in a negative sense. Once you dig into history, you see that his visions were also motivated by some scientific, but also some occultists' belief in unity that drove his project, and that were sometimes or held sort of ambivalent relationships with the modernist avant-garde and their beliefs.
So he's very much part of the modernist period, early 20th century, but I'm wondering what he thought of the Enlightenment project, the encyclopedic works of the Enlightenment, Diderot and D'Alembert, and then their 19th century successors, which were, after all, in the business, as was Otlet, of classifying knowledge, retrieving information from sources. I ask this also because Vannevar Bush, whom we mentioned earlier on, the American engineer who in 1945, in a famous article in the Atlantic Monthly, proposed a personal microfilm device called Memex, which probably stood for memory extended or memory index or something like that. And he, in that article, was extremely critical of encyclopedias and the current library cataloguing system. So I'm wondering, what did Otlet say, or what did Otlet think about that encyclopedic tradition?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think Otlet was very critical of libraries at that time and of encyclopedias as well. So he invented at that time, or he conceived of what he called offices of documentations, which he thought first would supplement but eventually absorb libraries, because he thought libraries used outmoded manners of dealing with catalogues, but also he thought that so not only the classification system, but also the information services that they provided were not very effective. And these offices of documentation, what they would do was to dissect publications, then look in these publications which facts were actually new and contributed to knowledge, then to transcribe these facts on separate pieces of paper or index cards, and then to have them stored in using the UDC system in sort of repositories that he then thought were the new encyclopedias of that time.
Is this where the new technology of microfilm had enormous attraction? I know that H.G. Wells, who had this idea in a similar period, 1930s, of a world brain, shrinking encyclopedias or information down into small space because of microfilm. Did Otlet have that idea?
Yes, microfilm was very important for him too. So he did experiments in the early 20th century with an engineer, Robert Goldschmidt, I believe is his name. So it's still one part of the archives of the Mundaneum that has been remained rather unexplored. But if you look at it, there is an enormous collections of microfilms, which he also sometimes used to project images during conferences, and of course it triggered also certain visions of him about how the future might evolve. Absolutely.
Yeah. Wouter, now if we could turn to your particular approach to Paul Otlet. In 2011, you completed your doctoral dissertation on Otlet at the University of Ghent in Belgium. How is your approach and your biographical approach different or similar to others published on Otlet?
Yeah, well, at the moment there are 3 biographies published on Otlet. The first one is by Boyd Rayward. He wrote a biography about the Otlet's endeavors for bibliography and internationalism, and showed how he was a pioneer in both those fields. And he described how Otlet and La Fontaine founded these 2 important organizations, the International Institute for Bibliography and the Union of International Associations. The other biography by Françoise Levy adds more to the what we know about the private life of Paul Otlet and all his about his pacifist projects, let's say. And also these his campaigns for realizing the Cité Mondiale. And then last year there was a new book published by Alex Wright, Cataloguing the World, and so he sees in these global network structures that Otlet outlined, he sees in that an anticipation of the World Wide Web today. Now the biography that I've written during my as my doctoral dissertation, and now that I'm now trying to turn into a book, is not so much a biography of Otlet as it is an intellectual biography of his utopian visions and schemes. So it talks about the genesis, the development and the substance of these visions, and a look at how these ideas related to the intellectual context of that of their time. Yeah.
So your initial training was in architecture. So how did you, as an architect, come to write about a bibliographer and a utopian thinker?
Yes, well, I think it had to do with also with the time period when I was studying architecture. So that moment in time, everybody bought a mobile phone, the World Wide Web was coming online. So also in the field of architecture, there was a lot of interest for that emergence of a sort of new virtual space. I don't know, when I started my doctoral dissertation, I was planning to write about these changing relationships between the mental and representational spaces and their relationship with the more physical, social spaces. And then it was my supervisor, Pieter Ruitenhoven, who pointed me to the work of Paul Otlet, and especially his project for the Mundaneum and the Cité Mondiale that Le Corbusier had drawn. These sort of projects that show that when you have these epistemological changes, that they also trigger changes in the architecture and the infrastructure that uphold the way we deal with knowledge. And then when I started searching and digging into the archives of Paul Otlet, I found these enormous collections of images and also a lot of architectural plans. And once I discovered these, there are about 8,000 drawings, I saw that, okay, there's a book in this, and, and that's how I started.
This interests me, the visualization of knowledge, of course, has a long prehistory before the 20th century in both two-dimensional and three-dimensional forms. You know, you have these trees of knowledge that go back to the Middle Ages, showing the relationship between various disciplines. You have the memory palaces that were thought about by the Greeks, but in the Renaissance, and towers showing the procedure whereby a student would walk up through the various subjects, elementary, intermediate, and the higher subjects at the top of towers and so on. But I gather from what you've said that Otlet takes this interest in images and visualization much, much further and in much more complicated detail.
Yeah, well, he certainly picks up on the examples that you've given. So also with Le Corbusier, but other modernists, he made these new memory theaters. Of course, on paper, he didn't build them, as a way to explain his metaphysical structures and his philosophy. But he also used visualization in other manners. One way was just as sketches, as a way of visual thinking. He thought about knowledge structures, so that was a way of thinking through images. Another, or probably the biggest sections of his images is what is called the Encyclopedia Universalis Mundaneum, and that comprises about, let's say 8,000 images or more. It's especially that collection that I worked on. That goes back to his long-standing interest in the museological display of information. So he founded a museum in Brussels in 1910, which he conceived as a museum of ideas, sort of spatial encyclopedia that would map the entire world of knowledge. And then in the 1920s he started to make these sort of picture encyclopedias, but that was mainly driven because of his conviction that the essence of all knowledge organization should be to synthesize information, and so that idea of synthesis is really at the heart of all his endeavors.